All right. World Regions Geography 110, Latin America and the Caribbean, Part 4. We're talking about economic accumulation and the production of inequality. Important concepts that allow us to look at what is going on in Latin America and maybe have a better understanding of why it's happening. So we have economic shifts. And basically, what you have, as some of you may have heard of, the Monroe Doctrine, was laid forth in the early 19th century by President Monroe. And he basically said that Europeans or non-Western hemisphere, in other words, no government from outside of North and South America should have any business in the Americas. And that included the British and the Spanish, and America put forth this policy to help it trade and help its economy, and began the political domination and economic domination of the Americas. So the economic shift, you have this Monroe Doctrine in America intervening in different parts of Latin America at different times regarding politics. You've heard of the term banana republics. That was because United Fruit wanted to have political control so that they could grow bananas in Central America. So the U.S. Marines went in and did replaced some governments there that were more friendly to United Fruit. Not proud of those things, but that's the reality of it. And those governments finally started collapsing in the 80s, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So there's a couple of concepts here that are real important. One is you began this domination by the U.S. economy of Latin America and Central America. And a lot of U.S. companies manufactured goods. We shipped them to Latin America. We were the primary supplier of manufactured goods. A lot of things like clothing and things that were manufactured in the U.S. and shipped south. Manufactured goods for refrigerators, cars, stoves, all those sorts of things were manufactured here and shipped south as finished products and traded as for higher amounts, and reduced the purchasing power of the region. The region in Latin America were primarily focused on producing primary goods, which are things like foodstuffs, like in case of Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Cattle were raised, and leather goods and meat was shipped to Europe, and not so much to the U.S., but mainly to Europe. In Brazil, it was coffee and sugarcane and rubber, and in Central America, coffee and sugarcane. The Caribbean, coffee and sugarcane. And you began with the economic collapse in 1929, which is what we refer to in this country as the Great Depression. You see this rise of countries in Latin America beginning this policy of import substitution. This is an important concept, so you'll want to know it. So import substitution is where a government, say in the case of Brazil, as an example, puts in a policy where they say, okay, geez, they've been shipping cars in here from the United States, and they've been shipping stoves, and they've been shipping refrigerators. Well, we want to manufacture them here. So we're going to subsidize local production of those products, even though they may be inferior products. We're going to subsidize the cost. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put a duty on imported goods. So we're going to increase the cost of imported goods to make the locally domestic produced goods economically competitive. And this policy of import substitution sounded really good, and it began to create some jobs and some industry in Latin America. You see it in Mexico at this time. You had the nationalization of various industries such as cement production. You had the petrol, the nationalization of the oil company, Pemex, these sorts of things. You see these nationalization. More recently, you've kind of seen that same thing in Venezuela, and it's basically had the same impact on Venezuela as it had everywhere else. Sounds good on paper, but the problem is people will just pay the higher price for the imported goods. The reason is because of quality. So when you produce inferior goods and you're not cost competitive, it actually ends up costing more money in the long run. And so consequently, people would spend more money for the imported good. This gradually, as this war on, began a debt crisis beginning some places in the 60s, but mostly in the 70s and 80s when you began to have inflation in the U.S. You had the Arab oil embargo, which caused a lot of inflation and readjustments in the United States, but it also caused incredible readjustment throughout Latin America. You had 2 or 3 series of debt crises in Mexico and Brazil, Argentina, Chile, all through Latin America, where these countries basically collapsed economically. They ran out of foreign capital, so they couldn't go out in the global market and buy anything. And that's when you began to have structural adjustment programs. And structural adjustment programs are a real fancy name for saying we cut out all the social programs. So think of like cutting out Obamacare, cutting out Social Security, cutting out welfare, cutting out education, cutting out every type of social program that you can think of, subsidized health care, whether it's that you're going to go to the doctor in emergency room. Well, you're not going to the doctor in emergency room because there is no emergency room, and if you don't have cash up front, they're not going to see you. So structural adjustment programs, it's something that's going on more recently. You saw it in Greece with some adjustments, also in Spain. This is after the 2008 financial crisis. So these sorts of programs cause a lot of social strife within the country. So because of that, you see increased migration and increased dependence on remittances. And for those that don't know what remittances are, it's the money that migrants send home to help take care of their families there. And it doesn't just mean their wife and kids. It might be an extended family. It might even be their community or their village. But it's a major source of foreign capital, and it's one thing that keeps countries in Latin America and the Caribbean solvent now. And these structural adjustments, as a way to try to get around that, countries encourage migration, which we're also going to talk about a little bit later. So free trade here, NAFTA, you've heard Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton talk about it. It was the first George Bush, President Bush, was the one that really began it, and it finally took effect, I think, during Clinton's time. And NAFTA has a lot of different effects. It's North American Free Trade Agreement, and it includes Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And NAFTA has a lot of aspects to it. One is environmental regulation. One is free movement of goods between those countries, which has increased trade between those countries. And another is extending labor laws across borders as a way to not only support workers in other countries, but also to make it more equitable. Now, maquiladoras, for you that don't know, maquiladoras were actually Mexican regions originally along the border with U.S. and Mexico, where American companies would, the Mexican government set as an attempt to get their economy going, they set up these regions. You saw them in Juarez and Tijuana, where Laredo, where they could have manufacturing plants that the raw materials or the components of assembly, they were more assembly than manufacturing, and the components would be shipped from plants in the United States down there. They would be assembled, and then they would ship back across the U.S. border without any taxes being applied either direction, so that they came back into the U.S. Having taken advantage of cheaper labor of assembly, the labor-intensive part in Mexico, and were shipped back across the border into the U.S. and sold. ALBA, which is a trade group in Latin America, basically Hugo Chavez in Venezuela organized this group, which included Bolivia and I think Ecuador and Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and Argentina and Chile, I think, but they were basically the socialist-leaning governments were trying to create a NAFTA type trade group in Latin America where they could trade back and forth, and it was being driven by oil profits from Venezuela. But when oil prices collapsed, it has had that adverse effect on this trading group because they don't have the money for it to work. Venezuela is on the verge of economic collapse, and probably within the next year or two, you'll see a major regime change and possibly even a civil war in Venezuela. Contemporary conditions, positive overall. You're starting to see a growth in all sectors throughout Latin America. Manufacturing's increasing. You're beginning to see agriculture profits increase. You have more free trade agriculture going on. Service sector and manufacturing is increasing. Fisheries, a lot of the seafood that we see in our markets are grown off the Pacific coast of Latin America in fish farms. If you've ever seen fish farms, videos on it's pretty scary stuff, but we like the inexpensive fish that you can get. Tourism, big business in Latin America. And the informal economy. Informal economy is anything, you see a guy selling oranges on the street corner. That's part of the informal economy. Somebody begging on the street corner. Somebody selling tacos on the street corner. That's all part of the informal economy. Basically, the informal economy is anything that's not taxed and generally not included in gross domestic product. So it's all these forms of business. Basically the drug business, everything is part of the informal economy. So you see that's going on. It's big in Latin America. It's big in this country too. We just don't, that's the guy that goes out, he doesn't pay taxes, but he does gardening. He may not be licensed, he does home repair. He may not be licensed, he does plumbing or electrical repair. These sorts of things, that's all part of the informal economy.